Lot 247, sold for $400. Nobody else bid on it. The auctioneer, a tired man named Hal Brewster who had been running estate and surplus auctions out of the same dusty warehouse in Tulsa for 26 years, almost skipped the lot entirely. It had been sitting in the back corner of Hangar 9 at the old Cimarron salvage yard for as long anyone could remember, a rust-streaked hulk of unidentifiable origin that the previous 3 owners of the salvage yard had all inherited without wanting and never managed to sell. The listing in the auction catalog read in its entirety: Lot 247, unidentified aircraft vessel, non-functional, sold as is, no title, no documentation, buyer responsible for removal. Marcus Webb bid $400 because his nephew dared him to. He was 53 years old, recently divorced, recently laid off from a logistics company that had decided his entire department could be replaced by software, and he had come to the Cimarron salvage auction because his nephew Danny, 22 and perpetually unemployed in the specific way that young men with too much time and too little direction tended to be, had wanted to look at a stack of vintage motorcycle parts in Lot 198. They'd wandered the warehouse for an hour before lunch. Danny had found his motorcycle parts, and then, walking past Hangar 9 on the way back to the truck, they'd both stopped and looked at the thing sitting in the corner. "What is that?" Danny had asked. Marcus didn't know. Nobody seemed to know. It was roughly the size of a school bus, but built in a shape that didn't correspond to anything Marcus recognized. No wings, no obvious engine housings, a hull that curved in ways that seemed almost organic, covered in a strange gray-green material that had weathered and pitted over what was clearly a very long time but had not rusted, not exactly, not in the way steel rusted. "Probably some kind of prop," Danny said. "Like a movie thing or somebody's homemade art project that didn't pan out." "Probably," Marcus agreed. He had not planned to bid on Lot 247. He had, in fact, planned to leave directly after Danny's motorcycle parts went up. But Lot 247 came up near the end of the day, after most of the crowd had thinned out, and the auctioneer rattled off the description in the bored tone of a man trying to get through the last few items before closing, and nobody raised a paddle, and Danny elbowed Marcus in the ribs and said, "Bet you won't." Marcus had spent the last 4 months unemployed, recently divorced, and increasingly aware that he had become the kind of man who didn't do impulsive things anymore. He had become careful, predictable, the kind of person whose ex-wife had told him during one of their final arguments that she didn't know who he was anymore because he never surprised her, never surprised himself, never did anything except exactly what was expected. He raised his paddle. "400, he said. The auctioneer blinked, recovered, and brought the gavel down before anyone could change their mind. "Sold, to the gentleman in the blue jacket." Danny laughed so hard he had to sit down on a stack of pallets. Marcus stood there holding the auction slip and looking at the rusted, pitted hulk of Lot 247, and felt, for the first time in longer than he wanted to admit, something other than the flat gray static of his daily existence. He felt curious. It took a flatbed truck, 2 tow operators, and most of the next day to get Lot 247 transported to Marcus's property, 11 acres outside of Sapulpa that he'd kept in the divorce because his ex-wife had never liked the place and Marcus had nowhere else to go. The thing was heavier than it looked, dense in a way that made the tow operators mutter about the manifest weight limits, but eventually it was sitting in the open field behind his barn, looking even stranger in the daylight than it had in the dim warehouse. Marcus spent the first week just looking at it. He walked around it every morning with his coffee. He ran his hands along the strange gray-green hull material, which felt cool to the touch even in the Oklahoma summer heat, and which had a texture somewhere between ceramic and stone, but with a faint give to it that neither material should have had. There were no visible seams that he could find, no rivets, no panel lines, nothing that suggested how the thing had been constructed or assembled. It was as if it had simply grown into its current shape. There was one opening, on what Marcus had started thinking of as the side, a roughly oval gap about 7 feet tall that looked less like a door and more like a wound that had healed badly. Inside, the interior was dark and cramped and filled with shapes that might have been seating, might have been controls, might have been nothing at all, decades of dust and dirt, and the detritus of small animals that had clearly made the thing their home at various points obscured most of the detail. His neighbor, an older man named Otto Reinhold, who had farmed the adjacent property for 40 years, and who Marcus had exchanged maybe a dozen sentences with in the 3 years he'd owned the place, came by on the second week to see what the commotion was about. Otto stood in front of the thing for a long time, chewing on a piece of grass, and then said, "Huh." "Yeah," Marcus agreed. "That's about where I'm at too." "You know what it is?" "No idea." Otto walked around it once slowly, the way a man inspects a horse he's thinking about buying. "My granddad used to talk about something like this," he said eventually. "Said back in the 50s there was talk of something coming down out past the Glass Mountains, way out in the Panhandle. Government people showed up, hauled most of it off, but my granddad always said there were pieces that went missing before the government got there. Local salvage men picked over the site first." He spit out the grass. "Story always sounded like nonsense to me. Old men telling tall tales." Marcus looked at the strange hull material, cool under his palm. "Maybe not as much nonsense as we thought," he said. That night, unable to sleep, Marcus did something he hadn't done in months. He got genuinely interested in something. He spent 6 hours online, searching through declassified government records, regional newspaper archives, and amateur UFO forums that ranged from credible to deeply unhinged, trying to find any reference to an object matching what was sitting in his field. He found fragments. A 1958 newspaper clipping from the Woodward News mentioning unusual debris, found near the Glass Mountains that local authorities had quickly stopped discussing. A declassified Air Force memo, heavily redacted, referencing an unidentified craft recovery in the Oklahoma Panhandle region in the same year. A handful of forum posts from amateur researchers who had been chasing the same scraps of information for decades without ever finding anything solid. Nothing conclusive, but enough that Marcus, sitting in his kitchen at 3 in the morning with cold coffee and a head full of questions, found himself believing, for the first time in his adult life, that something genuinely impossible might be sitting in his backyard. He decided, somewhat irrationally, that he needed to fix it. He had no idea what fixing it would even mean. He wasn't an engineer. He'd spent his career in logistics, moving freight and managing supply chains, a job that had given him a decent if unglamorous understanding of mechanical systems, but nothing remotely close to whatever this thing required. But he had 4 months of unemployment, a severance package that gave him breathing room, and a curiosity that he hadn't felt in years. So he started cleaning it. It took 2 weeks just to clear the interior of decades of accumulated dirt, dust, animal nests, and general decay. He worked carefully, photographing everything before he moved it, treating the project with a kind of respect that surprised him. As the interior cleared, the shapes inside became clearer. There were indeed seats, 4 of them, low and strangely contoured, arranged around a central console that was covered in raised symbols Marcus didn't recognize and small indentations that might have been controls, might have been something else entirely. Nothing powered on. Nothing responded to touch. The console was as dead as the rest of the ship, and Marcus began to wonder if fixing it was simply an impossible fantasy, a hobby project that would end with him owning a very large, very strange piece of lawn art. He kept cleaning anyway. There was something meditative about the work, something that filled the hours he used to spend job hunting and doom-scrolling and arguing with himself about what he'd done wrong in his marriage. Out in the field, with his hands busy and his mind focused on a problem nobody in the world had solved, he found himself, slowly, becoming a different version of himself than the one who'd walked into that auction house. The first real breakthrough came in week 6, when Marcus, cleaning behind what he'd started calling the pilot's seat, found a section of the console that had been covered by debris and corrosion. Underneath, once cleaned, was a small panel with a single indentation shaped roughly like a human hand, except the proportions were slightly wrong, the fingers too long, the palm too narrow. Marcus stared at it for a long time. Then, because he had become a man who did impulsive things now, he pressed his hand against it. Nothing happened immediately. Marcus felt faintly foolish, sitting in the cramped, dust-smelling interior of a decades-dead alien wreck, pressing his hand against a panel like he was in a movie. He was about to pull his hand away when he felt it, a faint vibration, almost imperceptible, traveling up through his palm. Then a single symbol on the console lit up, dim amber, barely visible in the daylight filtering through the opening. Marcus didn't move, he barely breathed. The symbol pulsed once, twice, 3 times, and then went dark again. But it had lit up. Something in this ship, after what Marcus's research suggested was at least 68 years of being abandoned and probably much longer than that, had responded to him. He spent the rest of the day in a state of focused, electric excitement that he hadn't felt since he was a kid, taking apart his father's old radios to see how they worked. He went back to his research with new purpose, this time specifically looking for any information about biometric or genetic locks, about technology that might respond to a hand pressed against a panel, about anything that might explain what he had just witnessed. He found very little that was useful, but he found something that changed the direction of his entire project. A series of forum posts, years old, from a user who went by the handle Cassiopeia Tracker, who claimed to have studied recovered alien technology fragments as part of a private research consortium before the consortium had quietly disbanded amid funding disputes. Most of the posts were the kind of unverifiable claims that filled these forums, easy to dismiss. But one post, from nearly a decade earlier, described something specific: recovered technology that used neural resonance keying, a system that didn't read fingerprints or DNA, but instead responded to patterns of neural activity, essentially recognizing not a specific individual but a specific kind of intent and engagement. The post theorized that such systems might be calibrated to respond to focused curiosity and persistent attention rather than any single biological marker, a kind of lock that opened not for a particular person, but for a particular state of mind. It sounded insane. It also, Marcus thought, sounded like exactly what had just happened to him. He went back to the ship the next morning and pressed his hand against the panel again. But this time he didn't just touch it and wait. He focused. He thought about the ship, about its mysteries, about every question he had accumulated over the past 6 weeks, and he held that focus as he pressed his palm flat against the indentation. The symbol lit up again. This time it stayed lit. And then slowly, more symbols around the console began to glow, one by one, like a string of lights being switched on in sequence. Marcus sat frozen in the pilot's seat, watching 68 years or longer of dormancy slowly give way to something that looked unmistakably like power returning to a system that had been waiting patiently for someone to ask the right way. Word got around Sapulpa fast, the way news traveled in small towns, not through any official channel, but through the accumulated gossip of feed store conversations and church potlucks, and the kind of casual mentions that spread faster than any social media post. Within a month, Marcus had received visits from 3 separate amateur researchers, a stringer for a regional news outlet, and a man who claimed, somewhat unconvincingly, to be a representative of an unnamed federal agency who wanted to discuss the appropriate handling of Lot 247. Marcus turned away the federal agency man, without much conversation. He'd done enough reading by then to know that appropriate handling generally meant, "We will take this from you, and you will never see it again." And Marcus, for the first time in years, had found something that was unambiguously his, something that he had brought back from the edge of being scrap metal through nothing but stubborn curiosity and a willingness to fail repeatedly. And he was not interested in handing it over to a man with a badge and a non-disclosure agreement. The amateur researchers were more useful. One of them, a retired aerospace engineer named Dr. Lillian Vance, who had spent 30 years working on propulsion systems for a major contractor before retiring to a quiet life of UFO conferences and self-published research papers, turned out to have genuine expertise that Marcus desperately needed. She arrived skeptical, examined the ship for 6 hours without saying much, and left looking like a woman who had just had several fundamental assumptions about her field violently rearranged. She came back the following week with equipment. Over the next 4 months, Marcus and Lillian worked together, slowly mapping the ship systems, cataloging the symbols on the console, cross-referencing patterns against the fragmentary research Lillian had access to from her decades in the field. It was slow, painstaking work, full of dead ends and false starts, but progress came in small, satisfying increments. They identified what appeared to be a primary power system, dormant but apparently still partially functional. Fed by something Lillian theorized was a closed-loop energy source that had simply been running at minimal capacity for decades, sustaining basic functions while waiting for the kind of activation Marcus had stumbled into. They identified a navigation system, its display dark but its underlying architecture intact. They identified what they believed was a communication array, though attempts to activate it produced nothing but the same faint amber pulse that seemed to be the ship's way of acknowledging input without yet having the power to do anything more. The breakthrough that changed everything came in month 5, when Lillian, working through a translation matrix she'd built by cross-referencing console symbols with patterns from declassified government research she'd accessed through old professional contacts, managed to identify what looked unmistakably like a diagnostic menu. "This is a maintenance log," she said, sitting in the pilot's seat with her laptop connected to a custom interface rig she'd spent 2 months building. "It's telling us what's wrong." What was wrong, it turned out, was extensive but not catastrophic. The ship had clearly suffered serious damage at some point in its history. Lillian's translation of the diagnostic data suggested some kind of impact or structural failure, consistent with whatever crash had brought it down in the Oklahoma Panhandle in 1958. But the ship systems, whatever species had built them, had been designed with a redundancy and self-repair capability that put anything Marcus had ever encountered in human engineering to shame. Significant portions of the damage had apparently been slowly, automatically repaired over the decades, drawing on whatever residual power remained, working at a pace so slow it was almost geological. The ship hadn't been dead all those years. It had been healing. "How long until it's fully functional?" Marcus asked. Lillian looked at the diagnostic readout for a long moment. "Based on the repair rate I'm seeing logged here, and assuming the self-repair systems have enough material and power to keep going, I think it's close. I think whatever damage kept this thing grounded for almost 70 years is nearly resolved." "Nearly," Marcus repeated. "The log suggests it needs an external power boost to complete the final repair cycle, something to push past whatever threshold its dormant power reserves can't reach on their own." Lillian looked up at him. "I don't know what that means in practical terms. I don't know what kind of power this thing needs, or how much, or whether anything we have access to could even provide it." Marcus thought about this for a long time. He thought about his career in logistics, about supply chains and energy distribution, about the practical, unglamorous knowledge he'd accumulated over 20 years of making sure complicated systems got what they needed to function. He didn't have an engineering degree. He didn't have Lillian's decades of aerospace experience. But he understood, in a deep practical way, how to solve resource problems. "What if we're thinking about this wrong?" he said slowly. What if the answer isn't finding some exotic alien power source? What if the answer is just scale, time, feeding it whatever power we can consistently for as long as it takes? Lillian considered this. It would be slow. "I've got time," Marcus said, and he realized saying it that it was true that the flat gray months of unemployment and divorce and aimlessness had become, somewhere in the last 5 months, something else entirely. He had a project. He had a purpose. He had, for the first time since his old life fell apart, something to wake up for. It took 11 more months. Marcus drained his savings buying solar panels, installing a small battery bank, running cable out to the ship through a setup that Lillian, with her aerospace background, helped him design to interface safely with the ship's power intake. A process that itself took weeks of careful, nerve-wracking trial and error, because nobody wanted to discover the hard way what happened if you fed an alien power system the wrong kind of current. Slowly, the ship came back to life. The amber pulse became a steady glow. The diagnostic menu Lillian had decoded began showing repair progress climbing, slowly, month over month, as the ship's systems drew on the steady trickle of solar power Marcus fed it day after day. The console lit up more fully. New systems came online that they hadn't even identified yet, revealing functions and capabilities that took weeks to map and understand. Otto Reinhold, who had become a fixture at the property by this point, watching the project with the patient curiosity of a man who had lived 70 years and seen plenty of strange things but never anything quite like this, was there on the morning the ship's hull began to change. It happened gradually over the course of about a week, but the change was unmistakable. The gray-green hull material, pitted and weathered from what they now understood was nearly 70 years of exposure, began to smooth. The pitting filled in. The color deepened, taking on a faint, subtle iridescence that hadn't been visible before. It was, Lillian theorized, the ship's outer material, whatever it actually was, something well beyond any material science she understood. Finally completing the same slow self-repair process that had been working on its internal systems all along, now accelerated by the steady power Marcus had been feeding it. "It's healing," Otto said, watching the hull shift in the morning light. "Whole thing's healing, not just the inside." "Yeah," Marcus said. He stood there, in the field behind his barn, looking at the ship that he'd bought for $400 on a dare, that had sat broken and forgotten for nearly 70 years before he hauled it home, that had slowly, patiently, with help, transformed from a rusted hulk into something that now looked less like wreckage and more like a sleeping animal beginning to stir. He thought about the 4 months before the auction, the flat gray static of a life he hadn't recognized as his own. He thought about his ex-wife telling him he never surprised anyone, including himself. He thought that the man who had stood in the salvage warehouse and raised his paddle on a dare would not have recognized the man standing in this field now. The final activation happened on a clear October morning, 18 months after the auction. Marcus and Lillian were in the ship's interior, reviewing the diagnostic logs that now showed, for the first time since they'd started tracking it, 100% repair completion across every system they'd mapped. The console, which had grown brighter and more complex over the past months, suddenly shifted entirely. The amber glow that had become familiar gave way to a cooler blue-white light. New symbols appeared, ones they hadn't seen before, and the entire interior hummed with a low, steady vibration that felt less like machinery and more like something breathing. A voice spoke, not from any speaker they could identify, but from everywhere in the cabin at once, translated somehow into clear, accented English that Marcus would later learn the ship had assembled from analyzing thousands of hours of radio and television broadcasts it had passively absorbed over decades of dormancy, slowly teaching itself the language of the world it had crashed onto. "Repair sequence complete," the voice said. "Operational systems restored, pilot recognition confirmed." A pause, querying duration of dormancy. Marcus and Lillian stared at each other. 68 years, Lillian finally said, her voice shaking slightly. At least 68 years, possibly longer. A longer pause this time. Acknowledged, the ship said. Original crew status. Marcus felt something tighten in his chest. We don't know, he said carefully. There was no crew here when we found you, just you, alone in a salvage yard. The silence that followed lasted nearly a full minute. Marcus had no idea how to read the emotional state of an alien intelligence, but something about the quality of that silence felt heavy, felt like grief processed by a mind that had spent nearly 7 decades slowly putting itself back together with no idea whether anyone was coming back for it. Understood, the ship said finally. Recalibrating mission parameters. Another pause. You have provided sustained power input across an extended period without requesting compensation or extraction of technology. This pattern is consistent with the behavioral marker designated patient curiosity in my threat assessment protocols. Reclassifying you from unknown variable to, the ship paused, as if searching for the right translation, to caretaker. Caretaker, Marcus repeated. You rebuilt what was broken without understanding what it was or what it could do for you, the ship said. You did this for nearly 2 of your years at personal cost, without external incentive beyond your own curiosity. A pause. In my experience, which is now considerably out of date, given the duration of my dormancy, this pattern of behavior is rare among species capable of recognizing technological value. Most who find damaged advanced systems seek to exploit them immediately, not repair them patiently. Marcus thought about the $400, the months of cleaning, the 11 months of solar panels and careful power feeding, the savings he'd drained and the purpose he'd found in the process. I just wanted to know what you were, he said simply. That, the ship said, is, in my experience, the rarest motivation of all. Lillian, who had spent 30 years of her career working on systems that never spoke back, sat very still in the co-pilot's seat, taking in every word with the focused intensity of someone witnessing something she would spend the rest of her life trying to properly document. What happens now? Marcus asked. Now, the ship said, and something in its translated tone shifted into what Marcus could only describe as something like warmth. I would like to show you what I am capable of, and I would like, if you are willing, to learn more about the species that found me broken and chose, for no profit and at real cost, to heal me instead. Otto Reinhold, watching from the edge of the field as the ship's hull shimmered fully into its restored iridescent color for the first time, would later tell anyone who asked that he'd lived 71 years in Creek County and never seen anything like the morning Marcus Webb's $400 auction. Lot rose 6 feet off the ground, hovered steady and silent in the October sunlight, and settled back down with a kind of grace that made it clear it had simply been testing what it could still do after 70 years of healing in the dark. Marcus stood in the open hatch, looking out at his 11 acres, at Otto's wide-eyed expression, at the life he'd rebuilt one impulsive decision and one patient month at a time. So, he said mostly to himself, now what? The ship, somewhere in its vast and ancient systems, processed the question with what felt distinctly like anticipation. Now, it said, we find out together,